Welcome to the China in the World podcast, a series of discussions examining China's foreign policy and shifting engagement with the world. The China in the World podcast is brought to you by Carnegie China and hosted by me, Paul Haenle. Welcome back to the China in the World podcast. I'm Paul Haenle, your host. On this recording of the China in the World podcast, my former colleague from the White House National Security Council, Meghan O'Sullivan, interviews myself and two other former National Security Council colleagues, Mike Green and Faryar Shirzad. All of us worked under President George W. Bush as part of his National Security Council team. Meghan served as Special Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan. Mike Green was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asian Affairs. Faryar Shirzad was Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, while I served as President Bush's China Director, as well as the White House representative to the six-party talks nuclear negotiations. In the podcast, we showcase the release of a new book that we all contributed to, entitled Handoff: The Foreign Policy George W. Bush Passed to Barack Obama. Meghan was one of three co-editors for the book, while Mike, Faryar, and I co-authored the China chapter. In the podcast, we discuss President Bush's approach and policy toward China, and how China, U.S. China relations, and U.S. policy toward China have all evolved since the Bush administration left office. A video recording of this event can be found on Carnegie China's website. I hope you enjoy.
Good morning and good evening and good afternoon, depending where you are joining us from on the globe. I'm Meghan O'Sullivan. I'm a professor at Harvard University and the incoming director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event with Carnegie today. It is a special event, in part because we're talking about a book that I have worked on. I'll tell you a little bit about it, but mostly because I'm reunited with some of my favorite colleagues from the Bush administration. We're, again, coming to you in the context of a book that all of us were contributors to that was recently released. It's called Handoff: The Foreign Policy that George W. Bush Passed to Barack Obama. And it's an unusual book in the sense that it's 750 pages long, but it's also unusual in what it seeks to do. It essentially tries to capture the essence and the content of the transition from President Bush to President Obama in the realm of foreign policy. One of our colleagues and one of the editors of the book, Peter Fever, describes that every 4 to 8 years, the U.S. government gives itself a lobotomy, that basically all of the documents of the previous administration go off into, get packed away, go off into archives, and the new team comes in with very little information about what's happened over the last 4 or 8 years. And Steve Hadley, who's the primary editor and real inspiration of this book, who was the National Security Advisor, he and President Bush put in place a system that essentially, I think, has really set the gold standard for presidential transitions, pulling together what amounted to more than 40 detailed, classified, highly classified at the time memos that would go from one administration to the other. What this book does is that it publishes in full exactly as those memos were written, declassified now, decades earlier than they might be otherwise by President Bush. And not only that, we also asked people who worked on these issues that either wrote the original memos or, in fact, worked on the issue in some other capacity to go back and examine the memos and write what we call a postscript to talk about, what the Bush administration got right, what it got wrong, what the legacy has been of the policies as they were crafted under the Bush administration. So again, what we're going to do today, there's 29 chapters in the book, and then there are 3 chapters that actually deal with the overall content of the book by scholars who are not in the Bush administration, but the 29 issues are very widely. And what we're going to do today is talk about China. And with me again, I'll briefly introduce my three former colleagues and friends, all of whom worked in the Bush administration in a variety of capacities. First is Paul Haenle, who was the Morris Greenberg Director's Chair for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a senior research scholar at the East Asian Institute at Singapore National University. Paul worked on China at the National Security Council in the Bush administration. I'm happy to see him today. We're also going to be joined by Mike Green, who was the senior director for Asia, broad parts of Asia in the Bush administration. And now Mike is in Australia. He's the CEO of the U.S Study Center at the University of Sydney, and happy to see him. And finally, we're joined by Faryar Shirzad, who worked in the National Security Council for President Bush on international economic policy. And today he is the Chief Policy Officer at Coinbase. So hello, Faryar. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to begin with some questions and have a conversation among the four of us, and then give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. I have more than enough to take us through the whole hour, if in fact that's what we end up doing. I thought I'd begin by asking some questions about the context of the time, because it was so different than the context that we're living in today. A little bit about the actual Bush administration approach, what came after, and then maybe some of the lessons that we learned from it. So, Mike, I'll start with you, and it's important, I think, to remember that the China that the Bush administration faced in 2001 when it came into office is very different than the China of today, and particularly on economic and military power. And I was wondering if you could just sort of sketch out for the audience, what kind of power China was at the turn of the century, what the general security assessment was of China, and how that influenced the Bush administration's approach at the time.
Sure, Megan, thank you. It's great to be with all of you. And this is a wonderful publication. I didn't write the transition memos. I was happily teaching at Georgetown and working at CSIS, but I did work on the postscript with Paul and Faryar. And this is really a unique insight into a transition with these declassified memos, and a lot we can learn from it. Today China is the world's second largest economy. When we were in the Bush administration, it was the third largest economy. When we looked at the Western Pacific, the Japanese Navy, the Maritime Self-Defense Forces, at the time could more or less handle the PLA Navy. Now the PLA Navy is 4 or 5 times larger than the Japanese military. That's how quickly it grew. So the capabilities China brings are massive today compared to what we face, although they were growing at the time. The other thing I think worth remembering is the intentions were different. What China was doing with its power was still a bit of an open question. Some people are looking back and saying we should have known all along China would be a menace. But I was in most of the meetings President Bush had with Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao. And when President Bush raised human rights issues, they argued back, but they would sometimes release dissidents. They would listen to him on religious freedom. Faryar can talk about trade disputes. They didn't listen to us most of the time. They listened to us some of the time. And we had some basis for testing what was possible with China while building up our alliances and our military in case it didn't work. It's different with Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin compared with Xi Jinping today. Xi Jinping is just a much more zero-sum, ambitious, tough character. So I think leadership and intentions changed. But as you said, Megan, it was not as powerful in China, although we knew there was an absolute potential that China would go in the direction we now see.
Great, thank you. Faryar, if I could ask you a similar question, but focusing more on the economics. So we remember that at the very end of the Clinton administration, Congress passed legislation that granted permanent normal trade relations with China. But when the Bush administration started, China was not yet in the WTO, and that didn't happen until I think the end of the first year or since. Could you just give us, similar to what Mike did, just a sense of how the Bush administration regarded China as an economic power and its economic potential in those trade relations in the early days?
No, I'd be happy to. It's actually quite interesting because if you think about any president's foreign policy, it's very much of a presidential prerogative. Obviously, Congress has a significant role, but in the end of the day, it's probably the area where the president's power is most broad and where there's most latitude. Trade and economic policies, however, are areas in which the authorities of the government are very much shared between the president and Congress. And the reason I start with that is that you had, as you said, a very significant bipartisan political undertaking by Democrats, Republicans, the House and the Senate, under the auspices of the Clinton administration, to essentially decide that the most tangible part of the U.S. China economic relationship, being the trade relationship, should be defined under the terms of agreement reached under the auspices of the WTO. And so, as you said, at the very end of the Clinton administration, and I was a part of this as a congressional staffer, we were able to get permanent normal trade relations passed by Congress and signed into law. And this was a necessary prerequisite for China's accession to the WTO. The actual articles of accession the Bush team did, but the point of all that is that you had a very clear undertaking by the American kind of political system to define what the terms of what was at the time the most significant aspect of the U.S. China relations would be defined under terms that Congress had spoken to and were largely governed under WTO rules. So the issue that ultimately the Bush administration, the president deserves a lot of credit to this, was not to stagnate and focus in a very limited way on trade as being the only framework for how to think about the economic relationship, but to think about what comes next. And so even though there was a lot of euphoria about China's WTO accessions, a lot of people were interpreting the economic and trade liberalization that came with the WTO as necessitating political liberalization and sort of ushering in this new paradigm of governance within China. Whether that was going to happen or not, in the Bush administration under the president's direction, we were very focused on what came next. And a lot of that was focused on transitioning beyond China as a trade power who had to increasingly increase exports to grow its economy, but to transition its economy to a domestic demand-based, consumption-based economy, like more mature economies. And that put in motion a whole series of initiatives that we pursued unilaterally, bilaterally, multilaterally at the IMF, at the World Bank, in a multitude of different places that ultimately became the real defining element of what the Bush administration tried to do in the U.S.-China economic relationship. And I'm happy to unpack that, but I wanted to kind of frame that out because it's an aspect that not a lot of people have understood or really written about, but it's worth some discussion here.
Thanks, Faryar. We'll definitely get to that. I want to actually ask all three of you, for your views on, was it naive to pursue the approach that we did? But before we get there, maybe Paul, I could bring you into the conversation and just lay out, take us back to April of the first year of the Bush administration with the EP3 incident, where you had a Chinese fighter pilot collide with a reconnaissance aircraft of the United States. And that created, a very tense incident that I'm sure you all remember well. And soon after, President Bush, said very, very forcefully that the United States would do whatever it took to defend Taiwan if Taiwan were attacked. It seemed in the early days that this was going to be a very confrontational relationship, but ultimately, that wasn't the character of the relationship for most of the time. What kind of changed in the early days there?
Well, thanks, Megan. And before I answer that specific question, just thank you for leading our discussion today. You've played a key role on the book, the Handoff book, but you also played an incredibly important role in the National Security Council under President Bush during that time, and were a wonderful colleague. Like Mike said, I did work on the transition memos but Dennis Wilder was in the lead on that. played an important role. But I really enjoyed working with Mike and Faryar on the postscript for the book. And, we talked about this aspect that, you had the EP3 incident, which you've mentioned. Even if you go back to the campaign when then Governor Bush was running for president in 2000, he said he saw China more as a strategic competitor than a strategic partner, which was interesting. And then we had the EP3 incident. It turns out, I think that then Governor George W. Bush was not making that comment as a matter to sort of give an indication of the policy direction, but more as a descriptive statement of how he saw China behaving and how he saw the relationship with the United States. And as Steve Hadley has said recently, in a sense, it sort of put the Chinese on notice that if Bush did win the election, they would be dealing with a new president that had some skepticism, frankly, about what direction China would ultimately take, as Mike has already pointed out, and that the Chinese needed to think about that as they engaged with the United States. So initially, a real message of toughness and skepticism sent by the president. I think that was good in terms of setting the table for the relationship with China. Within the first 3 months, of course, we had the EP3 incident, as you've mentioned. Once we got beyond that, I think as a transition memo on China points out in the book, it was clear that despite the tough initial position by President Bush, he wanted to pursue a constructive relationship with China and try to bring China into the international system more. And it's clear, if you read the transition memo, that President Bush saw both opportunities and challenges with China. He did pursue the opportunities and gave Chinese leaders then the benefit of the doubt. And there were leaders in China at the time, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Zhu Rongji, the premier, calling for greater reform and opening up. And President Bush gave them the benefit of the doubt, choose to pursue those opportunities, but at the same time, also dealing with the challenges that China's rise presented to strengthening, by strengthening our alliances in the region, by putting in place building blocks, frankly, that we see subsequent administrations now turning to. And so I think that it's important to point out that, and we can talk about it more, I think that's a good question to ask. I don't think President Bush was naive. I don't think anyone in the National Security Council was naive, but wanted to pursue those opportunities, but really also tried to, either balance and hedge against the potential that China would move in or evolve in ways inimical to U.S. interests.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. Actually, in the book, as the three of you know well, there are two memos in this section, one about China specifically and one about East Asian alliances. And I think it does get to this question of, was the approach, what else was done besides having an approach that was hopeful that it would help move China in a positive direction? And as somebody who was working on the Middle East when all of you were doing this, I often hear from people, oh, the Bush administration was completely distracted by the Middle East and it didn't pay enough attention to China. And I think that the memo and the postscript about the East Asian alliances really demonstrates how much was happening on this front. And so, Mike, I might turn to you, and you're someone you've written widely on alliances as well as worked on strengthening and building them. Could you say a little bit about this, like what what was done on the alliance front and what was the intention behind all of the efforts there in the context of our policy towards China?
Yeah, I think it was important, as Paul said, it was a legacy of alliance building that now forms the core of the Biden administration strategy in the region. So when I first met President Bush, I didn't work on the campaign. I was hired into the NSC because I was an allies guy. I was an expert on Japan, Korea, Australia. And my first meeting with the president, he said, we're going to work on China, but we're going to really need our allies. And your job and the NSC's job is to continually strengthen those alliances. And the legacy includes things like the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, India Quad, which is one of the pillars of the Biden administration's approach to countering Chinese hegemonic ambitions. That was started by the Bush administration after the Indian Ocean tsunami. A critical pillar for the Trump and Biden administrations dealing with a more aggressive or assertive China was the strategic partnership with India. That was the Bush administration, largely Steve Hadley, working through in a very painstaking way the obstacles to closer relations with India that had been in the way throughout the Cold War. In a similar way, strengthening our bilateral alliances with Japan. With Korea, we had in Nomuhyun a bit of a wild card in those years, a bit of an anti-American administration, and that was all about patiently working through issues with Koreans. I wrote an article in the Washington Quarterly on this, just assessing and pulling together all the surveys in Japan, Korea, Australia, and in 2008, 2009. Support for U.S. alliances in Japan, Korea, Australia was higher than when the Bush administration came to power, in spite of Iraq and other things that happened in between. And the Chicago Council on Global Affairs did a big study in 2009 on soft power, and they asked across Asia what country has increased its soft power the most over the previous 10 years. Namely during the Bush administration. And in every country, the answer was the United States has increased its soft power the most over the previous 10 years. There was only one country where people thought the U.S. had significantly lost its soft power, and that was in the United States of America, where the American public was told, we're terrible, everyone hates us, we've lost it. So when you really look at the survey data, there were some tough times. We had very tough times with Korea, tough times in Southeast Asia because of the wars in the Middle East. But you look at the survey data about alliances and about American soft power, and they were in very strong shape when this transition happened. And they now form the absolute core of the Biden administration strategy, as they should, because China did turn in ways that we did not predict, but anticipated would be possible.
Thanks, Mike. So let's, before we move on, you've all sort of touched on this, the idea of the Bush administration having kind of an eyes wide open approach as it engaged China. But now in retrospect, what do you say to critics who say that was a naive approach and that it's that approach that ultimately allowed China to become a strong power and to challenge the United States? Did the Bush administration get this policy towards China wrong? I'd be curious, you don't all have to answer, but if you all wanted to respond in it's, not enormous length, that would be interesting.
Well, I can jump in. I would say, one aspect of it, the trade aspect of it, was predicated heavily on the idea that the WTO was a bit of a panacea. I think Democrats, Republicans, I think, frankly, much of the Western world had kind of decided that the WTO, in broad terms, essentially covered under its disciplines the broad terms of what was necessary to achieve trade on fair terms between nations. And I think what we learned over time was the limitations of the WTO, because the Chinese largely complied with most of their WTO obligations. But what we began to see is if you had an economy of China's scale with as much of a export superpower engine as they had, it began to reveal that even within a fairly compliant posture on terms of WTO rules, you could have huge dislocations in terms of the impacts of the trade volumes that came out of China, even if there weren't actionable trade WTO violations, it could be pursued. And I think, in a way, the problems with the trade relationship between the U.S. and China were kind of part and parcel of people kind of realizing the limitations of what the WTO could do. The other side of it is that we began to realize that it wasn't all about trade. We became, as a nation, increasingly focused on protecting technology, and that began to play out. Now, some of this we can't really talk about, but there was CFIUS cases, for example. This is the process by which the U.S. government reviews inbound investments. It was largely a sleepy area of law where the presidents rarely intervened on foreign investments. And you'll see there were news reports early in the Bush administration, and then increasingly so going into the later part of the Bush administration, of the CFIUS mechanism being used increasingly by the Bush administration to intervene in areas where China was trying to invest in to strategic sectors in the United States. Now, this was a little bit of a upward increase that you saw, which then continued probably around the same trajectory into Obama, even more so under Trump, and continues now into the Biden administration. My point in that is that the trade relationship was initially defining, but there were other issues, including protection of technology, investment screening, things like that, that became increasingly important in the relationship. And the Bush administration was not afraid to use them in the context of the time. And that was something that was sort of the beginning of a trajectory that we've seen play out in the years since.
Great. Thank you, Faryar. That really takes us up to the current day. But Paul, do you want to come in on this question of, were we naive?
I do. And, I recall I wasn't in the White House at the beginning when policy was being debated and formulated, but I understand there were a range of views in terms of what we should do on China. And there were some voices saying that, we needed a tougher policy that looked more like containment. And ultimately, that didn't win out. As we talked about, the president decided that he wanted to pursue those opportunities, but set up measures to protect and defend in the event that the challenges emerged more forcefully. I think that was the right decision for a number of reasons, and I don't think the administration was naive. They pursued those opportunities. But if you hear the arguments today, for example, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the international discourse, there's a narrative out there, which I don't agree with, but it's out there in the international arena that says, in a sense, Russia was somehow forced to, move into Ukraine because of NATO expansion and because of a U.S. policy that was too aggressive. Now, I don't buy that, but I don't think anybody can say that today, going back to the Bush administration, the Obama administration. And actually what I hear is that the Bush administration gave it a shot, and that Chinese leaders ultimately have chosen the path that they're on now, which is not just of concern to the United States, but it's of concern to many countries in the world. They've chosen that path for their own reasons. And that is very clear. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that we did give this a fair shot. We still are open to engagement and cooperation, but ultimately it's going to depend on the leaders in China and what path they decide to choose going forward, just as much as it was in the past. We can only deal with a China that wants to deal constructively with us. If that's not in their interest, then it's hard to do.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I try to think about what the conversation might be had the Bush administration taken a much more confrontational and aggressive approach, and China still, went the path that it is on today. I imagine that there'd be a lot of blame heaped on the Bush administration for pushing China into a more confrontational approach, when in fact, as you say, maybe this was really determined inside of China rather than a result of external forces or U.S. policy. Before we move on, Mike, do you want to add anything to what Faryar and Paul have said about this question?
Yes, and to what you just said, which I think is right. And also, what is the core of the Biden administration strategy for dealing with a more assertive and menacing China? It's U.S. alliances and partnerships. It's how we're maintaining what Condi Rice called a balance of power that favors freedom. In 2003 or 2 or 4 or 6, if the U.S. had actually done what some critics are saying, and tried to strangle China in the cradle, tried to contain China, in those days, we wouldn't have had a single ally on our side. We would have been completely unilateral and alone, and we would have significantly weakened the balance of power and deterrence and the toolkit we're now using to deal with the China we have. So it just wasn't realistic. It's fine in retrospect to say we should have contained China earlier. We would have been completely alone. And we wouldn't have had the majority of the American people with us, because the American people also, we are a democracy after all. A majority of the American people thought China was likely to be a partner in the long run, not a threat. Today, a majority of the American people see China as a challenge and a threat. So I think, we have to be careful about the revisionism. I do think the president was realistic about China. I don't think that 9/11 or Iraq changed really in any fundamental way the way that the president or the administration thought about China or the assumptions they had. It did take resources away. The strategy would have been more effective, but that's another debate for another day. The war on terror in Iraq and 9/11, none of that changed the assessments or the strategy. We did exactly what we would have done anyway to try to deal with China. The only question, as I said, was the resources available. I do think that one of the most important things that changed China was the global financial crisis. And, the Clinton and Bush administrations probably, none of us, but the Clinton and Bush administration's Congress bears some guilt for that, I suppose, but also the Bush and Obama administrations got us through it. But the GFC definitely affected China's assessments of us and its own role. And I think in retrospect, Faryar will have views on this. We and the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, underestimated how much the global financial crisis in particular would undermine support for international trade. And that was really fundamental to our strategy with China. As Faryar knows, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP agreement with Europeans, all these things were building a superstructure of rule-making among the major economies to get China to become the kind of economy that Faryar described. But we, the United States, started pulling it apart in the Trump years. But that was frankly because political leaders in the previous 10, 20 years didn't do enough to shore up support domestically. I think we were all surprised by that in retrospect.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to ask the three of you a few more questions, maybe for the next 10 minutes or so, and then open it up to our audience, see if there are some questions there. There are basically two baskets of things I'd like to cover. How did the Bush administration do, and what are the lessons learned? But I encourage people to start putting their questions into the chat if they would like. So Faryar, if I could turn back to you, I want to read a couple sentences out of the postscript just on this whole question of how the Bush administration did. And I know that the three of you really kind of wrestled with this question when you were writing your postscript. So the postscript says, and I quote, "In hindsight, the administration overestimated the extent to which the multilateral trading system in its current form could discipline the worst excesses of China's state-led economy. More needed to be done to reform the WTO and enable the institution to manage distortions from state-owned enterprises, intellectual property thefts, state subsidies, and indigenous innovation policies." So when you look back at that, is that a clear, this is a place where we could have done better, we could have better enforced China's WTO accession agreement and disciplined those distortions? Do you think that, when we look back with the benefit of hindsight, is that a clear place we might have done things differently?
It's a really good question. I think one of the big things that we learned over the course of the years that China increasingly joined different multilateral institutions. And this was also a lesson that was relevant when in my role as the G8 Sherpa. And I recall that it was the G8 at the time, so Russia was in it as well. There was this kind of framework that people put, and I forget who developed it or who came up with it, but the idea was you want to make sure when you let a country into a multilateral organization that they adapt to the organization and the organization doesn't have to adapt to them. And I think that was sort of one of the questions about Russia's participation in the G8 was that did it somehow undermine the coherence, the effectiveness, the purpose of the G7 by bringing Russia in and making it the 8. And I think the same issue kind of quickly became front of mind for a lot of people. Has China's entry in the WTO been a catalyst to change China, to make it a multilateral, make it a rules-based trading nation, or did China's entry change the WTO in some fashion? And I think for the early years, they didn't particularly change the WTO. They were busy implementing their obligations under the WTO. There were certain safeguard mechanisms and things like that countries like ours had available to us to take action in areas where we thought the Chinese may have engaged in unfair trade practices of one sort or another. But it was slowly over time that we began to realize that, and again, this is true for a variety of multilateral organizations, that China went from a very kind of observer, passive taker of the obligations and the norms of multilateral organizations, and increasingly over time, and probably particularly so after the end of the Bush administration into the Obama administration, became increasingly assertive in changing these institutions to its own will. So I think that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that a lot of the things that we blame China on are, in some ways, failures of our own domestic national strategy and understanding the advantages the U.S. had and the risk of squandering those advantages. And what do I mean by that? So one gigantic area that really began to become an area of focus for us in the Bush administration, but then increased into the Obama administration and so on, was the fact that we should stop being complacent about the special advantages of technology and innovation that we have in the United States. And so that's where CFIUS, for example, came in, becoming slowly initially, but increasingly through the Bush administration and then beyond, protective of strategic sectors and strategic technologies that if the Chinese were able to acquire through investment would somehow be, would kind of lose U.S. control over or dominance over. And we learned the hard way, I think, collectively as a country, that was much an advantage that the U.S. had that could be lost much more easily than we thought. So right now, here we are 20 years later, the loss of with fears about not having a cutting edge semiconductor capability in the United States, the loss of dominance on 5G, how Chinese technology dominated that. Some of those things really came to pass after the Bush administration. But as a national consciousness, as a national strategy, it took us a long time to realize that those were the stakes we were playing with, and we should have probably been quicker in responding to that in terms of a strategic national resource that we needed to be more protective of.
It's really, really interesting, Faryar. So I want to ask the same question maybe to either you, Mike, or Paul, but on the security side. So we think about the rapid modernization we've seen of the PLA over the last 20 years or so. Is there anything we might have done to be better prepared for that, or to help our allies be better prepared for that? Were we surprised by how quickly that advanced? And when you look back in retrospect, do you wish something had been done differently?
Our colleague Randy Shriver, who was in charge of China at the State Department, that had that job at the Pentagon in the Clinton years, and he said that we're always surprised. If you go back 20 years, sort of the 30 years of the post-Cold War era, the U.S. is always surprised when we look back at the previous 5 or 10 years, how quickly China advanced its military capabilities. So we shouldn't be surprised that we were surprised, but we were surprised. And we did, sort of in the same vein as Faryar has discussed, we did let some capabilities lag. About 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, the commander of the Pacific Command, Harry Harris, gave a speech at CSIS, and he publicly acknowledged that we had let our surface combatants, our destroyers and frigates, missile ranges stagnate. So our surface-to-surface missile ranges stayed the same. The Chinese Navy made their missile ranges longer and longer so they could hit us from far away. And we didn't do anything about that. So there were certain capability sets where in the Bush and Obama years, we should have had more urgency, should have had more resources. It got stuck in a variety of ways. The Budget Control Act messed with the Obama administration. Iraq, obviously, and Afghanistan, the war on terror, took resources from the Bush administration. I think those were in some ways insurmountable, that you couldn't make those requirements go away completely, but there should probably have been more of a focus on some of these key capability sets. The Trump and Biden administrations are trying to catch up and in some cases doing a good job. So in the security side, I would say there, we frankly, probably, and this is more of a handoff to Paul, but I think the China expert community might have been a little more forensic and a little more precise in understanding what the sort of neo-Maoist, leftist, movements in Chinese politics meant. Because Xi Jinping is not just someone who created this more nationalistic, aggressive China. It also had an organic element. And I don't remember hearing a lot of analysts warning us that this aspect of China is more dangerous than we think. But I turn over to Paul on that one for a deeper assessment. I'm a Japan expert, so that's my outside view.
Yeah, let me first say before I respond to that, I do think that the point is fair, and we are, as Mike said, in a sense today having to catch up on some of that. You do remember in the Obama administration announcing the pivot to Asia, and I think this was a recognition that we need to put more into our force posture in the region to deal with a increasingly aggressive China. A lot of people point to the Trump administration as sort of the change in assessment in the United States about China. I would actually put it in the second term of the Obama administration, around the time where the Chinese were building islands in the South China Sea, engaging in cyber theft of intellectual property of American companies in the billions of dollars range. And very clear that on the economic and trade side, and Faryar can talk more about this, but that they were not going to make the changes that the international community in the United States were hoping that they would make to have a more level playing field. There was a very vigorous debate within the Obama administration toward the end about how much tougher the posture of the United States should be. So it wasn't the Trump administration that came in. The Obama administration initially announced the pivot. They had some difficulties resourcing that. And we still see today trying to realize that pivot to Asia that was started in the Obama administration. There was, again, I'd want to just make the point again, there were so sincere efforts by President Bush and the administration to work with China in the region on security issues. I was the White House representative to the six-party talks. Mike was involved in that issue early on, in fact, traveled to North Korea as well. We were really giving it, and that was, by the way, a very contentious issue in the interagency, in the U.S. government. I used to say the negotiations within the six-party talks were more difficult in Washington than they were in Pyongyang. But President Bush wanted to give it a try and wanted to work, in addition to working with Korea and Japan, our strong allies, wanted to work in a sincere way with the Chinese. We did make some progress. Obviously, if you look at the situation today, that progress doesn't amount to much. In the six-party agreements, there was something called the Northeast Asia Peace and Security Mechanism, which, again, very controversial. But the idea was if we could work this North Korea issue to resolution or to find a better place, that ultimately we might have a new security architecture in the region where China was involved and we were working in a constructive way with China. None of that played out. And I think in large part because of what Mike's already talked about, the changes that we've seen emerge in particular under Xi Jinping. But as Mike says, these changes were bubbling up along the way. And I think it's fair to say that we weren't quick enough to identify some of these trend lines. But as anybody who's working on China knows, it's often very difficult to understand what's happening. They're not an open, transparent system like in the United States. They don't have a Chinese equivalent of Bob Woodward out writing books about the debates and the interagency in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. So I think we caught up with it eventually, but it didn't start with President Xi. President Xi's taken that movement, as Mike calls it, the neo-Marxist sort of leftist movement, and kicked it into overdrive. And that's why now I think the Biden administration is having to, really rely on some of the elements that we put in place in the Bush administration to balance and hedge now against China, because that's the China we're having to deal with today.
Hey, Meghan, if I could add a coda to what Paul said, it is also worth, I think, pointing out that no one is more surprised by Xi Jinping's China than the business leaders, scholars, diplomats in China who were, in many cases, close to Xi Jinping as he rose. So there was, let's just say that the Chinese experts were also blindsided by some of these changes.
Can I add one thing to that, which is, I don't know if you remember this, Meghan, but when President Bush went to the Olympics in 2008, he was very clear he was going to support the athletes. And it was not an official visit in that sense. But, he knew he had to meet, obviously, with the Chinese president, Hu Jintao. And we encouraged him to meet with one other individual. And that was this emerging leader by the name of Xi Jinping. Those were the two meetings he had in Beijing in 2008. When we were back in Washington last month, I asked, in that meeting, was it clear that we were dealing with a different kind of leader? And it wasn't. Then Vice President Biden spent hours with then the Chinese Vice President Xi Jinping, both in the United States and in China. This is a gentleman a leader who's kept his cards very close to his chest. And as Mike said, has surprised a lot of Americans, but also a lot of Chinese as well.
Thank you both. Again, I want to encourage anyone who's listening in any corner of the globe to put in a question or two. In the meantime, I'm going to shift and sort of talk about the current time, and with the benefit of reflecting on how things went in the Bush administration and subsequent administrations, talk a little bit about how we should be approaching China today. So I'll probably ask you each a question, and then if we have time, I'll give you an opportunity to make any closing comments you would like. But Faryar, you've mentioned a couple of times about the technology piece, which is obviously so central to the competition between the U.S. and China now. And I thought you made a really interesting point that, for a long time, the focus on the economic side had to do with trade, and now it's become much more a game about technology. How do you think the Biden administration is doing and handling the technology side of this competition? And is there anything that we have learned from these decades that you think would argue for a different or a different approach in any way than what is happening now?
It's a really good and important question, and it's a really fascinating one. It's it'd be worthy of a lot of unpacking, because I've watched this quite closely over the course of the years, and I would say, and Paul, I think, alluded to it from a different angle, but it was interesting. We, as an administration, the Bush administration, became increasingly worried about China's investments in terms of certain sectors. As I said, that continued. It really hit a kind of a very visible point, pitched and visible point towards the end of the Obama administration, where then Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker made some very sort of emphatic and strident public comments about not standing by and allowing U.S.'s technology advantage to get hollowed out by the Chinese, to be acquired and essentially repatriated into China. And the reason I'm responding to your question about the president that way is because probably from that moment on, you could probably attribute it to those late years of the Obama administration. There's been a bipartisan consensus that is carried over through the Trump administration and into the Biden administration that we have to just lock down technology much more comprehensively and much more strategically. With the pandemic, I think that probably doubly amplified, strengthened that resolve beyond technology into kind of the broader universe of supply chains. And so I think so that's a long way of answering your questions, which is that I think the Biden administration's is doing a good and effective job. The issue of the moment is whether we'll, as a country, through legislation, begin to impose outbound investment restrictions. So recall, CFIUS is an inbound restrictive mechanism where the government can review inbound investments and potentially block them. nobody ever imagined that we would have restrictions on outbound investment. And now that has become something that most people are expecting to happen in some fashion or another. So does the Biden administration deserve some credit for that, if you assume that that's the right policy? Perhaps, but they're really reflecting what is largely one of the big, few but important areas of bipartisan consensus that exists in Washington, is that we just have to lock down this policy. So that period from Pritzker, late Obama, all the way through Trump into current day Biden is less about the individual administrations that are in office as much as that there's a collective sense of action that has animated and produced legislation and policy action that have been really interesting, but largely bipartisan in nature.
Great. I think in closing, I'll probably ask each of you very briefly if you can comment on how you feel about the bipartisan consensus to be as really tough on China as we seem to be able to be, and whether that, that is something that's infused with wisdom or with risk. But I've got another economic question before I go to it. Paul, let me ask you, this is a little bit of a question from me, and it has to do with China's global role and international role. And recently we've seen China become the guarantor of an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that's really striking to me in the sense that 10 years ago, I think it was inconceivable that China would seek to play a geopolitical, a diplomatic role in the Middle East, that it was pretty happy just to focus on economics. And I'm curious, given your intimate knowledge of China, do you see, this is really a very different era of the many things we've talked about of this new China. Do you see its desire not just to be a regional power, but really to be a global power?
Well, I see a China that is looking to change the international system in ways that are more aligned with its interests, its own narrow interests, and much more aligned with the preferences of China and other authoritarian states. And I think we need to be very clear about that. If the Chinese sort of brokered Iran-Saudi deal had happened in 2005, when we were pushing for China to be a more responsible stakeholder, but we hadn't seen the China emerge that we see today, which is much more authoritarian, much more aggressive abroad, repressive at home, we may have had a kind of a different feeling about that. But in today's environment, I think it is concerning to me, the degree to which the Chinese narratives and propaganda is resonating in places like the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, in parts of Asia, frankly, where I am here. And I think we have to be have our eyes wide open about that. In a sense, the framing of that President Biden uses of democracies versus autocracies, I think, is not helpful. Because we need to be appealing to a much wider swath of the world, because it is a competition for influence and ultimately the direction that our international system evolves to. And we've all benefited in the current international system, including China. But it is very clear to me that they want changes, and that, I think, is a big part of their increasingly strategic alignment with Russia.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So we just have 5 minutes. I want to direct a question to Faryar from Gutta Hegarty about what you think about the BRICS moving away from the dollar. And I know there's lots of concerns about that, particularly after Xi Jinping's trip to the Middle East and more trade being done in the renminbi. And if I could ask you just to try to address that maybe in a minute, and anything you want to say in closing, and then I'll go to Mike to make any closing comments he likes, and then we'll end with Paul.
It's a really good question. It's hard to do complete justice to it, but there is an organic and slow but steady movement away from the dollar. You can see strategically, particularly with the imposition of the recent sanctions on Russia through SWIFT and otherwise, that our countries are beginning to develop alternative financial infrastructure and payment infrastructure to try to get around the dominance of the dollar and the control that the U.S. government has over a lot of the infrastructure of the global financial system. It's one of those balances, and Meghan, you're actually one of the world's experts in this, that always has to be struck in terms of using the powers that we have through sanctions and economic measures, and then weighing them against what the unintended consequences are ultimately in terms of the ability of people to build systems around and outside of the reach of those sanctions. And so I don't know if we've reached the end point in that, but it's an issue that's worth closely watching, including the pullback of American banks, which used to be dominant globally, and they've now de-risked for a variety of reasons, including U.S. domestic compliance controls that have made U.S. banks less and less interested in being in the emerging world, and Chinese banks have filled that vacuum and brought, RMB denominated, financial activity into those economies. So it's a really important question. It's hard to do it justice, but it's something that, I know Treasury and others are focused on. I don't know what the easy answer is, frankly, to it.
Yeah. Thank you. Mike, anything that you'd like to touch on in closing that we haven't addressed? Like, there's a million things we haven't addressed, but
yeah. So
we've done well.
I started working on all this stuff in the Clinton Pentagon and then in the Bush NSC. And there have been debates, as long as I've been in government, about how far forward we should lean with our allies. And the Biden administration rightly is all in with allies because China gives us no choice. So we're doing things like transferring our most advanced technologies to Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines. We're helping Japan develop strike capabilities, things that there'd be no agreement on a few years ago, and now there's broad consensus. So it's all about allies. But sitting here in Australia, traveling to Japan a lot, there are two things the Biden administration hasn't got right. It doesn't mean they can go back to exactly what the Bush administration does, but they've got to come up with something. So the first one we talked about is economic statecraft, trade policy. We probably aren't going back to the TPP. The WTO is largely broken, but in Tokyo and Canberra, in Seoul and Singapore, what you hear again and again is we want stronger American leadership, but you have got to come up with some way to align the leading economies to push China on things like digital trade, data reciprocity. We don't have a rulemaking strategy. Can't go back to what Bush did, but can't fight with nothing. And then the other missing element is probably can't go back to the Bush or Obama administration's efforts to engage and build partnerships with China. That's going to be very, very hard. But you got to have something. And right now, the official line out of the administration is that peaceful coexistence with China is not impossible. That's what the White House National Security Strategy says. What the heck does that mean? If you're in Tokyo and in Seoul and Canberra and Singapore and Ottawa, they want to reduce their economic dependence on China, but they need some kind of relationship with China, and Washington hasn't articulated what that looks like. Can't go back to what we did. It's a different era, but those two pieces still haven't been filled in.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think that's a good assessment. Paul, we're at time, but want to give you a chance to close us out.
Very quickly, just put an exclamation point on something Mike said. To remember then, I think he was Secretary of Defense then, Ash Carter, the late Ash Carter, a friend of many of us on this call, said he would give up an aircraft carrier for the TPP. It was strategic. It was important. And I just want to sort of reinforce what Mike said there. I agree with Mike. I mean, I think that we need to ask ourselves where we're going here, right? Strategic competition is not a strategy. It's a description of what's going on, but it's not a strategy. It's not an endpoint. And we haven't asked that question well enough and debated that internally. And we need to think about, we did that in the Bush administration. Transition memos will point that out if you read that. We had a sense of where we wanted to get to. And I suspect that's going to be very difficult because, under the current leadership in China, I think it's going to become even more authoritarian. I think they're going to push hard, as we were talking about before, to change the international system in ways that threaten and undermine our own interests and those interests of our allies and partners. And I think we're going to have to get to a point, and a lot of folks are working on this in the think tank and academic community. Mike, Meghan, you've been part of thinking of ways, despite the differences and the growing list of differences, can we develop some principles and operating mechanisms for managing the relationship so that we don't end up just simply moving to greater confrontation and or at the most dangerous end conflict, because that's not in our interest. And so I suspect this is not going to get a lot better anytime soon. Mike and I have an op-ed that we're going to put out here in the next couple of days. It sort of says that, but we've got to think about how do we develop these principles and operating mechanisms to manage the relationship so we don't find ourselves with the worst outcomes.
It's great. I think it's a great note on which to end, and really look forward to that op-ed and hearing your voices, make that case over and over again, because the cost of the current trajectory are potentially very high for the United States and for others as well. So we've come to a close. I just want to thank the three of you, Faryar, Mike, Paul, for being fantastic colleagues, but also for contributing to this volume and spending this hour together discussing these issues with such clarity. So thank you very much. And thanks to Carnegie for hosting us all.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care. Good night.
Thank you for listening to the China in the World podcast. For more episodes and research, please go to carnegieendowment.org. This episode was produced by Nathaniel Schur. The music was composed by Spencer Barnett.